Hi, I'd like to invite everyone, or welcome you rather, to a interview I'm doing with David Gerrold, who is a very long-standing and very well-known author in science fiction, and has worked in both. He's written books and stories. He also worked quite a bit in film and TV. Um, where I want to start the discussion, though, is with the subject that I'm quite sure many science fiction fans, I'm one of them, have an answer that they want. But before I get into that, which involves a long-running series involving an alien invasion of critters that are sort of like worms, I have the more basic question before that, which is, David, how the hell do you pronounce Couture?
Well, I say it's Tor. It's like the word Victor, only you leave off the vi. So Tor.
Tor. All
It's
right.
in one of the books, but nobody ever paid attention. It's like, didn't you read the book?
All right, so the CH is basically silent, just the Tor. All right, folks. I wanted to get that cleared up because I don't want to do the whole interview and discover afterwards that I was mispronouncing it all the way through. You began that series a long time. I know you began a long time ago because I read the first book pretty much when
I
it was
was I was house sitting for Donald Westlake. He had a house out in Culver Lake, and this was in the 70s. I was in New York. I was living in Greenwich Village, and my agent was Henry Morrison. And he said, Don Westlake is getting a divorce and needs someone to house sit the house and feed the dog. Big, unkempt looking Afghan, beautiful dog, but really needed grooming. I tried brushing him, couldn't keep up. And so I had written half of The Man Who Folded Himself and gotten to a point, I don't know if I want to keep going on this. And I wrote 14 chapters of A Matter for Men. And this is in like 1970, 71. And then my agent called, Henry Morrison called and said, I just sold The Man Who Folded Himself to Random House. So I had to put A Matter for Men aside and go to finish The Man Who Folded Himself. And I picked up A Matter for Men again in mid-70s, I think, and didn't finish it until 82. Yeah, the first two books were published, and it was supposed to be with Timescape, David Hartwell and Lou Aronica. And then Irving Applebaum came in and shut down at Pocket Books and shut down the whole Timescape line. And I was supposed to have like 100,000 first printing in hardcover, and instead I got like, I don't know, 10,000. And it was really disappointing. Anyway, I went over to Bantam Books and sold a bunch of books to Bantam. And in the mid-90s, I did books 3 and 4, and Bantam published. And they had actually the salespeople would go into a bookstore and they'd say, we have books 1 and 2 coming out. And they'd say, don't talk to me about books 1 and 2 until I know when book 3 is coming out. And they said, yo, yeah, we're doing first book 1, then book 2, then book 3. So that was at Bantam. And I did 2 books at Bantam, and I was hard at work on the 5th book in the series. And Irwin Applebaum, may he rot in pieces, came over, took over, shut down their science fiction line, same thing he'd done at Pocket Books. And I went over to Tor, and Tor said, well, we'd love to have these, but first we need you to do some new stuff for us. I did Jumping Off the Planet, Bouncing Off the Moon, Leaping to the Stars. So now here it is, 20 years later, and you can see these boxes behind me. Half of them are filled with notes that and from 1970, I would write down I type up a page and put it in the box of notes. And then when I got a computer, I started organizing my notes. But I have files and files and piles and piles. But I bought a new scanner, and I'm getting everything scanned in and organized. Now, book 5 is mostly finished. There's maybe 5 chapters that I have to write. Key chapters that explain what's at the bottom of the nest, which will explain everything. And then what happened was I pulled half of that out because it had grown to like 350,000 words. So I pulled half of that out, which will be book 6. So book 5 will be A Nest for Nightmares, and book 6 will be A Method for Madness. And my plan is to have it finished this year. But I also have to finish the sequel to Hella, because I had a sequel. Hella had been written in response to something I saw on television. I said, no, they're doing it wrong. This is not how you colonize a new world. And I just spent a couple months writing a first draft. That was, I don't know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. But I never knew how to end it. And then one day I just sat down and said, I'm going to finish this thing and get it out. And I tried to sell it to Tor. I tried to give it to Tor, and they lost it for a year. And then when I did finally get a copy in their hands, they sat on it for another few months and then said, no, we don't want to do this. All right. So, which is a shame, because I'd really like to have a better relationship with Tor Books. They're really good people. Moshe Feder, Tom Doherty, Patrick Nielsen Hayden. I love them all. And I really want to have a better relationship with Tor. So I'm going to get the Tor books finished very soon. Because I'm not getting any younger, and
Yeah.
I kind of like to just kick back and retire and just not have so much pressure on me by the time I'm 80. I'm an old man. I don't look it. People tell me, oh, no, you don't look your age. But I've been around almost as long as Norman Spinrad and Bob Silverberg. In fact, I think they're the only 2 guys who've been writing science fiction longer than me. There might be a couple others.
There are many, I know that.
Yeah, I feel like I'm playing Last Man Standing. I've lost this. I've lost Harlan Ellison and Dorothy Fontana, who were my 2 closest mentors.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know who to talk to sometimes. It's like I can't pick up the phone and call them. Well, the connection charge would probably kill me. So.
Yeah, I know.
I miss them.
I came into writing very late in life. I started as a very young man, but then I just set it aside for a long, long time. And I didn't start writing again until I was 45. And I didn't get my first novel published until I was 50. So my own career as a writer is despite my age, is actually, 23 years.
Let me say this. I think you have to live a life before you can write. There's a lot of people who are writing, and you can tell by their books that they haven't lived a life yet. And one of the things that interrupts my writing is I go out and do things that aren't writing because I need to learn something. And people say, why don't you stay home and write? Because I can't write without source material. I can't write without a life. The Martian Child wouldn't have happened if I hadn't had gone and adopted this really amazing little boy.
Yeah, I think one thing I like about being a writer, it's because basically what you're doing as a writer is you're translating your own life, you're using your raw material, so to speak, is your own life experience. And like I said, the more of that you get, the more you can kind of. So the thing I like about being a writer is that it's one of those fairly rare trades that actually you tend to get better as you get older, as opposed to being, a mathematician where supposedly you're over the hill by the time you're 30, or a gymnast, or or something where, once you get past a certain age, it's kind of, you're sort of coasting after that.
If you're an athlete, your career is over very early, and all that's left is like coaching or something else.
Or in some cases, you find something else and you basically create a second career, which some athletes do. But still, it's the one thing that's really nice about writers. And I tell people who are middle aged who are thinking about writing, but they get kind of down in dumps because they think, well, it's too late. I said, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. I've just actually, with my own publishing house, which I've had for a few years now, I just published first novels by a lady who's 75 when her novel came out, and a gentleman who's almost 80. And, you know, they're both continuing to write. Anyway, however,
if you have something interesting to say, it doesn't matter how old you are. My son was, you know, when he was 9, he sat down, he wrote like a 10-sentence story, and it was very passionate. It explained where he, you know, how he saw the universe. And you know, I mean, I know there are people who just think, well, it's just pulp fiction, I'm just turning out words. And, you know, we call those people hack writers. But the truth is, every time you put words to paper, as you say, you're expressing who you are, how you see the world, what, you know, you're sharing a piece of how your mind works. And the reader comes to a book and he's letting someone else think with his head for a while. Or same thing with music. When you sit down and listen to a symphony or a song or whatever, you're letting somebody else think with your brain for a while. You are surrendering to someone else's process. And if you come to it with the judgment of this is not what I wanted, this is not what, you're missing the experience of submerging into another way of thinking. And that's the adventure in reading any good book. You know, Heinlein takes you to a specific set of worldviews, and Ursula K. Le Guin takes you another worldview, and Harlan Ellison, my God, I don't want to visit that world, but I have to because it's scathing. And you know, Discworld is amazing. It is Terry Pratchett. His essential emotion, you have to read carefully, is anger at everything that isn't working. And so he's showing you a world that works no matter what. And it's a fun world. He makes it fun. But there's things where he reveals his anger very, very clearly. And you wouldn't be able to appreciate any of this if you weren't willing to surrender to the author's worldview and way of seeing things.
No, I agree. For one thing, the distinction that is made by many people between literature and genre fiction is they don't understand a lot of things, but all it is marketing. Otherwise, you know, Moby Dick would be sold in the science fiction section because no whale that ever lived behaves like that one.
Wasn't it based on an actual event where a white whale did?
On the Essex being attacked, but yes, sperm whales have been known to attack ships, but the relentlessness of Moby Dick and the sort of personal nature of the conflict with the captain is it's like the movie Jaws. No shark that's ever lived has behaved like that one does. But the thing that I tell people about writing is that what a writer is doing, most of what's in a novel is put there by the reader, not the writer. The writer is giving a framework and a set of guide points, and it's more like an impressionist pointillist painting where you're putting up dots, but it's really the reader. 90% of what's in a book is the readers filling it in with their own imagination.
Yeah, Ted Sturgeon said something akin to that. He said, you have to know what is in every nook and cranny. You're not going to report it,
right?
But you have to have an idea what's in every nook and cranny. And when you write from that space, the reader fills in with his or her own emotional equivalents.
Yeah.
So, like, if I were to write a story about how much I love my dog, the reader would, you know, over here is a pit bull, and over here is a fluffy little Shih Tzu, and over here is a Labradoodle, but the emotional context would be the same, unless I describe the dog, in which case it becomes a different experience. You know, some people don't like yappy little terriers, and some people don't like great big goofballs, you know. I like dogs. I don't care. You know, the dog. Every dog has a unique personality. I think they're fascinating animals.
Let me ask you, because you've also done a lot of work in in television. And I mean, you wrote what I think may be the most famous Star Trek episode ever. I'm not sure. It's certainly one of
It's a
them.
toss-up between that and City on the Edge of Forever.
Yeah,
And
yeah, that would be the other one. And
Harlan,
who wrote?
hang on a minute. Sean, I'm in an interview. Well, you can let him in if you want. Sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Anyway, no, Harlan Ellison and I had an agreement. His is the best episode. Mine is the most popular.
That would be a good way to divide the credits. His was certainly it was a great episode. There's no doubt about it.
It was a very un-Star Trek-like episode. Very, but the thing is he was pushing the formula he was pushing the characters. Yeah. And after that episode, Kirk could never be in love again. You couldn't do that story again. It would never have the same impact.
Are you ever likely to work in television again, do you think?
Ever likely to work what?
In television again.
Oh. If the phone rings, yeah, I'd certainly listen. But, Gene Roddenberry never forgave me for asking to be treated fairly. And the Writers Guild went after him because he had been cheating me and Dorothy Fontana. He'd been doing some credit jumping and underpaying, and he never forgave me. And so he was telling people I was a terrible human being, and I am, but he was telling people I was a bad writer, which that I could not forgive. And I couldn't get an agent for 10 years, let alone get into anybody's office. Yeah. And even today, there are people who believe I'm a terrible human being, not to be trusted near a script, whatever, even though they've never met me, because I have this reputation, which Roddenberry started, and his little enablers helped spread the word that I, was a monster of some kind. And so in one respect, though, they did me a favor, because not being able to write for television, I went home and wrote 10 novels. And at the same time, working at home, I was able to adopt a little boy. If I'd have been working in television, on a staff job, if I'd have been working on a staff job, I would not have been working at home. I wouldn't have been able to adopt Sean. So they did me a favor. I became a better writer because I was working on my own stuff. And I became a better person because I got to adopt my little boy, and he grew up to be a marvelous human being. So I actually had a much better life. Not as profitable as, if I'd have been working in television, I'd be cutting coupons, collecting residual checks every week. But because that stuff goes on forever. But, the novels have my name on them, nobody else's.
Yeah. No.
Speaking of the dog, he just, yeah, okay. He just had a haircut. Yes, thank you.
One of the things I have discovered, I've now done, just from organizing this convention, it's a very ambitious convention, and there is a brand new saying emerging that organizing a virtual convention is a lot trickier than it looks. But one of the things,
organizing anything is a bitch.
Huh?
Organizing anything is a bitch. You have to decide where everything goes, and you have to make sure everything arrives at the same time. It's like an assembly line.
That's true. I mean, one thing, we did ourselves a favor when we decided early on we were going to pre-record, basically. There's a few things we're doing live, but we're basically pre-recording everything, and that's going to make our life a lot easier. If you're doing a molecular convention, I'll call it, all the molecules have gathered in one hotel somewhere. So organizing them is not too hard because they're all right there. But if you're trying to organize people, not just all over the country, we have panelists from New Zealand, Thailand, England. If you're trying to get all those people together on a screen live, boy, I don't even want to think what that would have been like. But one of the things I've discovered, you just get used to it. when you're interviewing people using Zoom or some of our things we've done on Google Meets, but everybody's sitting in their own house, you're going to have interesting backgrounds, number one. Number two, the picture and audio quality is going to vary a little bit, but the other thing is just get ready for kids wandering around the background or dogs jumping up or, you know, noises happening. It's just the way people live. I kind of like it myself.
Hang on a second. I'm going to put Charlie. This is Charlie. I'm going to put Charlie. Charlie, look, Charlie here. There you go. I'm going to put him in his kennel.
All right.
Charlie, yes, I love you. Charlie, he's a spoiled brat. I will be right back. All I have to do is give him his cookie.
Go ahead.
His kennel is right here by my desk, but he's not a great, he was abused or something, and he was a stray for a while, and we got him. He was a rescue. So he has a lot of bad habits. So his safe space is his kennel in the house. And then I take him outside 3 or 4 or 5 times a day. So he gets his exercise, but we're working around his bad habits the same way we're working around mine.
It's probably a little late to start correcting yours, David. I know it's probably going to be hard for me to correct.
If you haven't grown up by the time you reach my age, you don't have to.
Yeah, that's the positive way of looking at it. Well, let me ask you a very broad question, which is, what do you think is good about science fiction, and on the flip side, what do you think is lacking from it?
Well, science fiction is I've given this speech a lot. It's a unique literature. If you look at any other genre, they're about the past or the present. But science fiction is about not just the future, it's about all the different possibilities that don't exist. So it's as Jerry Pournelle used to say, it's the research and development division of the human race. We are considering, what does it mean to be a human being? How does the universe work? What's our place in it? Who are we? What do we want? What are we going to do? And it's theology for the modern man. You know, it used to be in the Dark Ages, like the priests we have all the answers. Science fiction is we have all the questions. And so as a science fiction writer, you can go anywhere in time and space, any possibility, anywhere in imagination. It's like being a literary time lord. You know, it's like you're like Doctor Who, only without the TARDIS. Although I wish I did have a TARDIS, that would be fun. And I think that's the remarkable thing about science fiction, which is why you get so many remarkable people writing science fiction. When you think about it, Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov and Harlan Ellison, Annie McCaffrey, Ursula K. Le Guin, Nora Jemisin, all of these incredible people, each one, every time, they sit down at the keyboard, they're redefining science fiction and reinventing what's possible and saying, all right, now let's think about this for a while. And to me, that is no other literature does that, because science fiction tries to be rooted in this universe. And I love fantasy. Fantasy is a lot of fun, and Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones are commentaries on our world as much as they take you to a different world. But science fiction has at its core, at its hard nugget little immovable molten iron core, there is that question of how does this universe, the one we're in, how does it work and who are we in it? And to me, that's exciting. It's like, I don't want to wander through life wondering, who am I? I am, because that's what we do, is we wander through life. Well, what do we do now? Who are we? But at least by asking that question, well, let me do it a different way. Let me approach this. There's a question, what does it mean to be a human being? And the answer to it is, who's asking? Because the only person who would ask that question is a human being. And that's what science fiction does. Science fiction is who's asking.
All right. What do you think are drawbacks or weaknesses in science fiction?
Um, our biggest weakness is we're only human, and we fall prey to the. And some of us, still haven't climbed down from the trees. Some of us are still 98% chimpanzee. And we can see that in some of the behaviors we see in fandom, but not just fandom, just human beings. But in fandom, there have been feuds in fandom since Jules Verne and H.G. Wells hated each other. They despised each other's. I mean, Verne was the optimist, Wells was the pessimist. They didn't like each other's science fiction. So science fiction has been one long feud because we don't listen to each other. And I think that's, the people who say science fiction has to be this or it has to be that, who want to put us in that pigeonhole, I think that's the mistake. I think science fiction is not a box to be in, but a pedestal or a foundation on which to stand and leap for the stars.
Well, you're right about that. I'm trying to think. I mean, authors are people, and so authors have their likes and dislikes. But I can't think. I'm trying to think if there's another branch of literature, because this is all part of literature, where people feuded as much. And I can't think of one. I mean,
horror, romance and horror.
Oh, all right.
Those genres. Those genres.
What was
amazing.
The romance and what?
Romance is one genre, and horror is the other, okay, where the feuds are amazing.
All right. Yeah, I suppose.
Although my experience with horror writers, I haven't gotten involved in any of the feuds. My experience with them when I went to a couple horror conventions is they're marvelous people, very elegant. They actually dress up,
really?
Not dress down, and they're courteous to each other. But that's in person. I don't know what, it's like, I don't know what they're like when they get angry at each other.
Well, I know when I partly it's because I came into. First of all, I didn't start writing when I was in my mid-40s. I didn't get published when I was 50, and I never went to a science fiction convention. My first science fiction convention I went to as an author. I knew about them my whole life. The time I was a teenager, I knew people held them, but it never occurred to me to go to them because, I'll be honest, I thought that's kind of for the weirdos, So I just never went.
Yeah, it is. But we're the weirdos.
I didn't encounter fandom until I was in my 50s, and maybe it was because of my age or maybe it's my temperament, I don't know what, but I noticed the sort of the feuding. And in fact, I was talking, Chris Barkley is one of our guests at this thing, and I asked him what kind of productions he'd like to be on. He said, well, I can do this, this, and this. Film is one of them. But he, in fact, he said I could also do politics of fandom, and I thought, oh boy, that would be a lot of fun. But no, I just think the fallout would probably not be worth it.
Harlan did an essay years and years ago called Xenophobia, and he contacted a whole bunch of writers, and it was the worst thing that ever happened to you with fans. And it's a whole screed about the behavior of fans, the bad behavior, the boorish behavior of a certain kind of fan. And I think he meant it as fans need to grow up and act like adults and learn some manners. But the thing is, fandom tends to be an adolescent, used to be an adolescent environment.
Right. And
people would learn their social skills actually coming to conventions and learning what they could get away with. I don't know that it's that anymore because the median age of fans is raising. And people are worried, is fandom aging out because the younger fans are coming into video games and movies and TV series and not the books as much. And yet there are more readers than ever.
Well, I told you this once, David. It's one of the reasons why, not this year, but I've been for a number of years now. I go to DragonCon every year. It's because it's a completely different generation. And while most of the people go there are drawn by the media attraction, the truth is by now it's the largest literary convention in the country, just because within that there's thousands of people who like to read a lot. And it's a different atmosphere in which people come up. And I don't know that there's probably any lack of feuding there, but it'll probably take a different dynamic. But
they've had their kerfuffles.
Oh yeah. You're going to find them everywhere. It's just, I remember when I first started coming to conventions and I'd run across just some of the feuding wasn't just between fans. I mean, authors would get into them too. And a lot of times I just, there
are some famous, I'm not going to rehash them, but when I first started hanging around, going to conventions and hanging around fandom, the feuds between authors were even more ferocious than the feuds between fans.
Oh yeah. I think
and the heat death the heat death of the universe will not end some of these feuds. They will last even longer than that. Nobody knows how to hold a grudge like
I know. I can observe it. I've never personally been able to hold a grudge. I think the longest one I've ever held was for about a year and a half. I just can't do it longer than that.
I don't have the energy for grudges.
And I think I hope at any rate it may extend my lifespan, because I just don't, I think being able to shed anger and stress is good for you. Well,
I don't talk about it in fandom too much, but I've had a lot of experience with what used to be called the human potential movement, a lot of trainings, courses, seminars, workshops, even to the extent of eventually being licensed to lead some of these courses. And one of the things I think probably the single most important benefit of any of these courses is you learn how to listen to bullshit for hour after hour after hour without having to react to it. It's like, oh yeah, okay, more bullshit. And you sit there and you listen to it, you get it, you take it in, you understand it. And after a while, when you become a coach, there's a whole other way of listening. You listen for what works and what doesn't work. As a coach, your job is to acknowledge what works and interrupt what doesn't work. And eventually, if you do it enough, it becomes a way of being. And pretty soon, you can listen to people without having to get into judgments. Oh, that's nice. Thank you for sharing that. And because you're listening for who is this person? And what is it they really want from me? Or what is it I can really contribute to them?
Well, I like to tell people that I have a superpower. I am able to walk away from a quarrel on Facebook without any effort at all.
I won't claim that as a superpower. Sometimes I mentally compose the whole rant before I decide, no, I'm not going to hit post.
Well, you're more active on Facebook than I am. I drop by your Facebook page regularly. I don't usually post anything, but
there's so much interesting stuff to share. And then the interesting thing is Facebook for me is a chance to actually interact with people, because really, when you're a writer, you're sitting alone in a room talking to yourself.
I know.
And the chance to actually spend time with other people. If I didn't do that, I'd probably have no social skills at all. I'm struggling as it is, right? So interacting with other human beings, I think, is probably the most important part of staying sane.
I agree. I wrote an essay for SIFWA's Bulletins a few years back, and the subject was, what's the right reason to go to conventions and what are the wrong reasons? And the gist of the essay was, if you think that the reason to go to a convention is to promote your work, you're living in a fool's paradise, because no matter where you are in your career, if you do the math, you'll figure out you're going to lose more money than you're going to make. Best thing you can do is just stay home and write. There are, however, because I go to a lot of conventions, or I used to, and I said the two real reasons to do it are, first, for your just mental sanity, because my job, basically, this is where you're seeing, this is a little cubby hole down in my basement where I write, and I come down here every day and I talk to myself all day. That's basically what I do. And it's just really good for me, and I'm missing it, to get out every couple months and go somewhere and interact with people. I didn't invent them. I don't know what they're going to say. It's just good. And the other reason is you do over time build up a professional network, and that network will pay off sooner or later, although you can't predict where. Unfortunately, the essay was published in the same issue of SIFWA that had the discussion between Mike Resnick and Barry Malzberg that sort of blew up a whole ruckus, and so I think it.
Yeah, that was an interesting one, because the issue there, the cover was Red Sonja. It was a tribute to a pulp heritage.
I know.
And of course, there were people who did not recognize that was Red Sonja. And I'm looking, oh yeah, Red Sonja, cool. Because, you grow up as an adolescent with, Tarzan and John Carter, Barsoom, and all of these heroes, Flash Gordon. And, someone reminds you of them, for a minute, you're a kid again. But Malzberg and Resnick made a mistake. They doubled down.
I know.
Instead of apologizing.
I told Mike that afterwards. I said, Mike, if you just say sorry, we didn't mean to, offend anybody, and just leave it. But no, yeah, you're right. That it was when they doubled down that the whole thing became.
Yeah. So I mean, I was kind of proud of myself. I could figure out that was a feud I didn't have to be a part of. I was like, oh yeah, okay. Like I'll just tiptoe away. But that's an old feud. It goes all the way back to we had the SEFWA forum back in the 70s, and Theodore Cogswell was the editor, and he was old school, good old boy, and he was posting so what he thought was funny, but the women in the organization felt was sexist, and they were right. There are women today who still haven't forgotten or forgiven that. But it created a feud that went on and probably cost the organization some goodwill and some members. And Cogswell eventually had to resign because instead of saying, I'm sorry, and learning better, he just kept doing it.
Yeah, I know.
He thought he was having fun. Well, by the patriarchal standard, yeah, he was having fun. But if the women weren't having fun and they weren't, then it's time to stop. Because they're half the organization. They're your colleagues.
What I don't understand.
It was disrespectful.
What I don't understand, David, is I can remember back when I was in college, sitting around a table at UCLA, and I used the word chicks in, course of conversation. And one of there was a woman sitting there, whom I had just gotten to know. I didn't know her very well. And she, not belligerently, but she said she really didn't like that term and would appreciate it if I didn't use it. So I started to mansplain to her that the term was actually not derogatory. And she just said, I just don't like it. And at that point, fortunately, my parents had taught me manners. And if someone tells you, I don't like to be called that, then it doesn't matter whether they're right. Yeah, just don't.
I had the same experience. I was referring to some of the women authors who I had bought for stories from an anthology. I referred to them as girls. Well, any woman younger than me is a girl. But somebody said, you refer to your male authors as boys? I said, oh, right. And I stopped using that terminology because I realized it was a microaggression to diminish their identity by calling them girls. They're not girls, they're full-grown women and are entitled to that respect. But it was a learning process. And so I actually said to the person who called me, I said, thank you for pointing that out. I didn't realize it was an unconscious thing. Thank you.
Well, there's all kinds of, and part of what gets to me is that, and you get this on both sides, but it's like people get tied up on who's to blame. It's like, that's really not the issue, and don't get tied up on it. It's a problem, just deal with it. Just move on. Stop doing it or figure out something that'll work better or whatever. But instead, people tend to get stopped at the point of it's your fault, your fault, your fault, or you're wrong, I'm wrong, you're wrong, whoever. And that gets you nowhere.
The assignment of blame gets in the way of producing results because if you want to be right, if you're self-righteous and you want to be right, you have to make the other person wrong. Well, how many friends do you make by making them wrong?
Yeah,
like,
I know.
Who really likes being told you're wrong?
Yeah, I know. Well, and then also you put people's backs up and you force people to have to back down, so to speak, or apologize.
Yeah, well, when you tell someone you're wrong, very few people say thank you. Most of the time they say screw you. They say, no, I'm not. Let me explain to you why I'm right and you're wrong. So, nobody ever wins an argument. What you do is you lose a friend, or you lose the possibility of a friend. Once I figured that out, it shifted my way of communication. This has only been in the past few years, but it takes time to learn. Even online, I used to love getting in online arguments and proving how right I was, because I had all this information, I had all the research, and I had the logic, and I had the resources, and I had megabytes of material I could dump on. So it's like, you know what? That's exhausting. I did learn a lot. I learned a lot about constitutional law because I did the research. But, but people go online, they just want to spout. They don't want to be taught. If somebody, now I'm to the point is like, if you want me to teach you, you have to pay me. It's like, and I've had people who have actually paid to be coached or to pay me to edit their manuscript. And I bill a lot. I'm not cheap anymore, but I don't give it away for free anymore.
No,
now you pay the writer.
I am capable of being pugnacious, but I have trained myself. I have what I call the 3-post rule, which if I get an argument online, I will say 3 things and that's it. I'm leaving. And I've had a few times people say, oh, you're walking away from a fight. And my answer is just simply, you know what? My time is actually pretty valuable. And
yeah.
I don't see any point wasting any more of it arguing, especially with somebody like you. I'd rather argue with a fire hydrant because all the fire hydrant's going to do is spew water.
Well, yeah. I've walked away from potential arguments. I said to people, "You win. Here's the trophy. Do you know where to stick it?" And and it's like, it is like but I have a thing I post from time to time. A conversation, a real discussion, is based on the idea that not only both people are listening, but both people are open-minded enough to change their position if they hear information that they did not have before. Yeah. And I've had people say, I'm not changing my mind. I said, great, there's no point in talking to you. Bye.
Yeah, no, there isn't. Let me ask you, David, how do you see yourself in the, I don't know what I'll call it, the pantheon of science fiction, let's call it. You've been, as you say, you've been active writer now. I hadn't thought about it till you said it earlier, but Bob Silverberg goes back longer than you do, and not much, though.
He started writing when he was 19. I didn't sell till I was 23, although I did do an animated educational film at age 19, so I can say I sold something at 19, but I didn't sell science fiction until I was 23.
Yeah, but I mean, you've been around for half a century now, and you've accomplished a great deal in your life. I leave aside whatever you've accomplished personally, but I'm just talking professional. So how do you see yourself? I mean, if you place yourself in.
At one time, I wanted to be like a grand old man. It's like, I mean, that was the goal, is to be like Heinlein or Sturgeon or Asimov, respected as a major voice, like a grandmaster. But then I noticed that a lot of our better writers never get acknowledged in that way. And I started thinking, it's not the position or the award or the recognition or the admiration that I want. So I want the work to be worthy of it. So I shifted my focus to what's the challenge of the next story? How do I write what do I still have to learn? What's the next thing in front of me? And so, it's not about the awards anymore, the recognition. It is, how can I just be my personal best and write the best possible stories and let that be whatever legacy or reputation I have. And so it's funny, there are these books that there's these encyclopedias and there's surveys and I never get much mention in any of them. I mean, in terms of that that mainstream of science fiction, whatever. I'm kind of like an also ran, which is okay by me because I'm not invested in. I'll give you an example. I loved Harlan. I loved Harlan very much, but he was a master of self-promotion, and much of his career was so much energy was invested in self-promotion that the writing suffered.
Yeah.
And his house, God bless him, but he turned it into a museum of great art and kitsch.
Yeah.
And pop culture. And it was kind of like the House on the Rock, the small version.
Yeah.
And all the effort that he put into all of that took away time from the writing. So my lesson that I took from that is anything that gets in the way of the writing, there has to be a damn good reason. What am I going to learn from it? What am I doing here that is going to make me a better writer? So adopting Sean was, I'm going to adopt a little boy so I have a family, but I know there are lessons I am going to learn. I will become a better person. I didn't know what the format was. If I knew, I wouldn't have to adopt the kid, right? But and all of those courses and seminars and workshops and all of the traveling I've done and all of the places I've gone and adventures I've had, what can I learn from this and how will it make me a better writer when I get back to the keyboard? So anything that gets into all these boxes behind me, that's stuff that I'm going to auction off, throw away, whatever. As I sort through it, I've got 50 years of stuff that piled up because I wasn't paying attention to what was piling up in my life. Now that I'm paying attention to it, I'm getting rid of the stuff that no longer serves me. If it doesn't serve the writing, it is a burden. If you are that committed and that passionate to your writing. If the writing is just a hobby, if it's just something you do when you feel like it, that's a different career. But over here, the writing has defined who I am, and there are stories I still need to tell. There are stories that I cannot drop dead until I complete them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think a lot of people, not just writers, fans too, get very hung up on issues of, I don't know what I want to call it, status, I guess, recognition, whatever you want to call it. And
well, that whole sad puppy, rabid puppy thing that went down in 2014, 15, 16, and still hangs on a little bit, that was not about the quality of the writing. It was about recognition. It was, you know, it was about people saying, I didn't get my Hugo yet. Well, the Hugo is not a participation trophy. You know, like, also, I didn't get my Hugo for 28 years.
Yeah, I'm not, I mean, hell, I've never been nominated for one. It's
Jerry Pournelle never got a Hugo or a Grandmaster Award. And God knows, you know, the man had an enormous impact on the field.
I don't know if you ever read them, but I wrote a whole long series of essays during that controversy, in which I disagreed with.
I read your essays. I read them. I remember them.
Okay. But, you know, yeah, one of the points I made is if you go to the Science Fiction Hall of Fame in Seattle, you'll discover half the people in it either didn't win any, didn't get nominated, you know. It has
Kurt Vonnegut never won a Hugo. Ray Bradbury never won a Hugo. I don't think Ted Sturgeon got a Grandmaster, I think, but I don't think he ever won a Hugo. I'd have to look.
I'm not
but
sure
I mean,
or not, but all kinds of people did. I mean, Andre Norton had this incredible career and was, she was nominated, I think, twice. I'm not sure if she ever won. Murray Leinster won once.
Murray Leinster was pretty much no longer, I mean, the Hugo didn't start till 52, 53, 54, somewhere in there. And by then he'd pretty much retired.
Yeah, I know.
So, and yet he was called the Dean of Science Fiction before Heinlein stole the title.
I know he was. And then on the flip side, Keith Laumer got one. He was nominated twice, and the second nomination came right at the end. And it was one of those, I know Dan Gunwell was kind of, oh, geez, we ought to do something for Keith Laumer. And the story that was nominated is so bad that I edited a reissue of 10 thick volumes of Keith Laumer's works, and that story's not in any of them because it wasn't worth putting in there. I mean, I don't want to sound cynical because I'm actually not at all cynical about awards. I mean, they're an honor that's given out by a group of people, and great, you know, if they give it to
Well,
you.
what makes any award worthwhile is the quality of the works that take the trophy home.
Yeah.
And if you look at, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this. There was a bookstore in New York in the 70s, and you could tell that the manager loved science fiction because you'd go to the science fiction section, and the top row was all of the Hugo and Nebula winners by the year, and they were labeled, you know, 1965, 66, 67, and you could see, and so, and you know, by 1980, 1990, you would go into the bookstore and you'd look at the row of Hugo winners, and you would see there had been a shift, and it wasn't a shift in quality. And let me say, whereas you wanted to go back and reread The Moon is a Harsh Mistress or Ringworld or Left Hand of Darkness, you'd look at some of the more recent winners and you'd say, I don't even want to read this a first time. Something happened. And I won't say that the books got bad. I'll just say that the field shifted. But to me, the recognition of the Hugo or the Nebula is the quality of the works that have been previously taken home the trophy. And when we do award inflation, or when people campaign for awards, it's like adding lead to the gold. It's destroying the quality of the reputation of the trophy. And so any campaign for an award, any social agenda about the award tends to overshadow the question I always ask: why does this book or this story or this work, what makes it worthy of taking home the trophy? Where's the quality in it? And I can argue that, I won't say which books, I can argue that the runner-up for a certain year was a much better book than the one that took home the trophy.
Yeah.
But everybody can make that argument.
The other thing I tell people is, look, there's only one objective measure of how good a writer is, or any artist, and it's real simple, and you're not gonna be happy to hear what I'm telling you, but the answer is this: are they still reading what you wrote 100 years after you died? And if the answer is yeah, it's at least some of yours is still in print and people are still reading it, then you are one very, very rare number of writers who was good enough in one way or another that your work outlived you by quite a bit. But the truth is,
well, that's the problem with science fiction. Science fiction gets dated.
It gets
very, very quickly.
It gets dated in some respects, but it is still true. People are still reading Jules Verne and they're still reading H.G. Wells.
Dune will survive.
Yeah.
Dune will survive. Moon is a Harsh Mistress will probably survive. But there are a lot of books that get dated because the science shifts or the culture shifts.
Yeah.
There are things that, just to get personal, if anything of mine survives, I hope it's The Martian Child.
Yeah.
And the thing is I've had people say to me, oh, it's not science fiction and it didn't deserve the Hugo Award. And I say, yeah, actually it did, because I'm biased, but it was an attempt to redefine the relationship of the writer with the medium, that we become so invested in the belief systems of thinking about other possibilities that it infects the way we think about our own private lives. It's like, I knew the kid couldn't possibly be a Martian, but what if he was, And so the story had another quality to it that you don't find in a lot of science fiction. It had an emotional relationship of family, and a lot of science fiction doesn't recognize family. The heroes and the villains exist in a vacuum. They have no, or the hero goes through the entire story and wins the girl. She's his prize.
Yeah.
But it's Heinlein's juveniles had family relationships, and a couple other writers acknowledge family relationships. But a lot of science fiction is the hero gets in his spaceship and goes, has an adventure. And you know, where's the sisters, the brothers, the mom and the dad, the grandparents, the kids, you know, where's the extended family? It's you know, it's like, oh yeah, here's our family, Kirk, Spock, McCoy, you know. No, they're crew members working together. Where's the real family relationships that illustrate who these people are, bring them to life? What do they care about? What will they sacrifice for? Not just the ship, but why are they on the ship in the first place? It's like, we have this question right now, is why are all of our young people joining the military? To defend the United States, because they care about what they perceive as our way of life. That's the conversation. And it's not just that, it's they're going to defend their mothers and their fathers and their sisters and their brothers and their homes. That's how they, I mean, that was the conversation during World War II. And that's the conversation that we still have about military service, is you are donating part of your life to stand up, to be of service for your nation. Mm-hmm. I think we've treated our troops badly as a nation. I don't think we've taken care of them properly, but that's the conversation about service that really ennobles the act of serving.
Listen, David, we're just about out of time. I always enjoy talking to you.
It is fun being with you.
I
Thank
would
you.
have been out in Los Angeles in April if this inconvenient virus had not appeared. And I was going to look up if you had been around, but in any event, it's been great to see you again.